In Asia, there's a war going on right now that barely anyone is talking about or even knows about. It is a war that has managed to kill tens of thousands of people and displaced millions. A war in which there is not just two sides, there are many, many, many more, with hundreds of varying different armed groups being involved, and because of that, there is just no end in sight. What I'm talking about, my friends, is the current ongoing civil war in Myanmar. Now, my friends, when we dive into this today, this is going to require a lot of explaining, because when someone describes a conflict in being messy, honestly, they could probably just slap a picture of Myanmar up on the dictionary and call it a day. Like, that is the end of that. And so it is because of just how messy this entire thing is, and the fact that it is ongoing, that I'm going to be doing something unprecedented here on the channel here today. This is going to be a two-part video, with today's episode explaining how it is that the state collapsed into civil war in the first place, and the next part explaining the actual conflict and disaster that would ensue, and where that leaves us today. I say this because even now, at the time that I'm making this video, there are some major changes that are possibly underway, and I do not want to preemptively call anything. Unfortunately, it seems that we have a habit on this channel of being very unlucky that every time we talk about something, a few days later, it all just blows up. You who've been around here for a while know what I'm talking about and will probably point it out in the comments. So, with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the mud and blood of what is arguably one of the oldest and worst ongoing conflicts in recent history. And from that, answer the question, how exactly did we get here today? Well, my friends, since gaining independence from British rule back in 1948, Myanmar has grappled with, well, the mere idea of effective governance in its multi-ethnic society. And by that, I mean that it has repeatedly failed in often very violent ways. After a coup in 1962, the Tatmadaw, which is Myanmar's military, has often had control, engaging in conflicts with ethnic minority groups that oftentimes fight for self-determination and autonomy, or just outright independence. When we talk about Myanmar, it is an extremely diverse country, with a state recognizing more than 100 different ethnic groups within it. Forming roughly two-thirds of the population, you have the ethnic Burmans, known as the Bamar. These have enjoyed a rather privileged position in society and have held a majority of government and military positions. Many ethnic minority groups, on the other hand, have faced systemic discrimination, a lack of economic opportunities, and development in their regions. These are individuals who oftentimes have minimal representation in government, if at all, and abuse at the hands of the military are common. As an example of one of these groups, who are technically speaking not citizens of Myanmar, but simultaneously they are a large population within it, you have the Rohingya. I'm sure a number of people have heard about them here on the internet before, and I could definitely do an entire video on them, but this is a highly persecuted Muslim group numbering over 1 million. Not a couple thousand, not a couple hundred, 1 million. This is a people that face discrimination both from their neighbors and their nation, as they are not actually considered citizens of Myanmar's government. Buddhist nationalist groups such as the Myawaddy and the anti-Muslim 969 movement regularly call for boycott of Muslim shops, the expulsion of Muslims from Myanmar, and also attacks on Muslim communities. After two waves of violence, reprisals, and riots in June and October of 2012 would intensify the century-old conflict in the predominantly Buddhist country, more than 100,000 Muslim Rohingyas were internally displaced, with hundreds being killed. And if you've heard the expression, that is just part and parcel of living in a big city, that, unfortunately, has just been part and parcel of living in Myanmar. Tensions between Buddhist and Muslim communities in Myanmar's Rakhine state would escalate dramatically in August of 2017. A series of attacks by groups of Rohingya militants calling themselves the Arakan Salvation Army, or ARSA, on military and police outposts would kill more than 70 people, including 12 Burmese security force personnel. In response, the military launched a brutal crackdown on Rohingya villages, causing over 700,000 people to flee across the border into Bangladesh since August of 2017. Widespread reports would indicate indiscriminate killings and burnings of Rohingya villages, escalating to the point that the UN Human Rights Commissioner called the situation in Rakhine a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. And it's not an isolated incident either. This outburst of violence in the military came after a similar attack on a security post along the Bangladeshi border in October of 2016, which had killed 9 police officers. The army responded to that attack with a month-long crackdown on unarmed Muslim civilians, causing more than 1,000 civilian deaths and driving tens of thousands to flee their homes to try and find safety. And again, my friends, when I talk about this, that is just one of the issues that we could mention here. This is all tied to a very messy political situation that is just as bad, if not worse, than the ethnic issues. Because you see, my friends, over the course of Myanmar's history, it has been ruled by a military junta. At least not all the time, but for many of the years since it gained independence from British colonial rule back in the year 1948. The Union of Burma began as a kind of parliamentary democracy, like most of its newly independent neighbors on the Indian subcontinent, but this was going to change. Representative democracy would only end up lasting until 1962, when General Ne Win would lead a military coup and would hold power for the next 26 years. It is this man who would have all of the authority, but eventually he would have to give up something. And so Ne Win would institute a new constitution in 1974 based on a isolationist foreign policy and a socialist economic program that would nationalize Burma's major enterprises. The economic situation would deteriorate rapidly after this, and a black market economy would take hold. By 1988, widespread corruption, rapid shifts in economic policy related to Myanmar's currency, and food shortages would lead to massive protests across the country. And then in August of 1988, the army would crack down on protesters, killing more than 3,000 and displacing many thousands more. Yes, remember when I said that the whole thing with political history was messy? This is something that is not an isolated incident, and you're going to see many more of. In the aftermath of this crackdown and the absolute chaos that ensued, in 1988, Ne Win would resign as chairman of his party. Although, that being said, he didn't just leave, he remained active behind the scenes as another military junta would take power. In 1989, the new military regime would change the country's name from the Union of Burma to the Union of Myanmar, and the capital, Rangoon, was renamed Yangon. A few years later, in 2005, the military government would move the administrative capital to Nay Pyi Taw, which is a city that it built in central Myanmar, and the junta argued that the whole reason why they were doing all this, why they changed the name from Burma, is that Burma was a vestige of the colonial era, something that favored the ethnic majority, and that Myanmar was something that was more inclusive of the variety of different peoples that encompassed the country. However, despite these calls for inclusivity, it doesn't necessarily mean that people were actually treated that way. And even if there are some feel-good measures about that, simultaneously the economic situation was still not good. Really, at no point in its history was the economic situation great, but some moments were worse than others. In 2007, you had a movement called the Saffron Revolution, where widespread anti-government protests were sparked by fuel price hikes and named after the saffron-colored robes that were worn by participating Buddhist monks. People were not happy with years and years of military rule and mismanagement, and so faced with large amounts of international pressure, the junta began to loosen its control upon the country, believing that it could still continue to rule Myanmar if it stepped back slightly. It is also possible at this time that one of the key reasons why they did this and loosened their hardline military stance is because they were seeking outside investment from sources like China and others. A new constitution was pushed forward in 2008, which is still, technically speaking, in place to this day, and that is something that gave the military widespread powers even under civilian rule. Yes, my friends, this is the really weird part that is going to require some explanation, but the military junta officially dissolved in 2011, and it established a civilian government, but one that was still, technically speaking, dominated by the military for a transitional period, and even after that, there was going to be certain features in place that were going to ensure that the military had a very strong presence within the government. We're going to explain that here in a second. But either way, during this transitional period, you would have former army bureaucrat and prime minister Thein Sein, who was appointed as president. Now, this guy, President Thein Sein, he did do some things. He spearheaded some reforms, including granting amnesty to political prisoners, relaxing media censorship, at least a bit, implementing economic policies to try and encourage foreign investment, things that would bring the country back on track to not just be a, military dictatorship. This would continue on for a few years, and it was actually then in 2015 that Myanmar would hold its first nationwide multi-party elections. Yes, not things just being restricted to the military to confirm their own votes into power. As it would turn out, the military would not maintain power. You see, my friends, it would be the opposition party, the NLD, that would win a landslide victory, driving the military out of power, or at least, technically speaking, they would still obviously have a presence. New lawmakers would then elect Din Kya as president, but as it would turn out, the real power was not this individual, it was Suu Kyi, a woman who was the daughter of independence hero General Aung San, who was appointed to the newly created position of state counselor and, despite not being president, effectively became the de facto head of the civilian government. You may wonder at this time, okay, well, what about the military? What exactly is happening with them? Well, the Tatmadaw still retained control over domestic security, most aspects of foreign relations, and many other matters related to domestic policy. If you're wondering how any of this is possible, it all goes back to the 2008 Constitution that the military put forth in the first place, which includes several provisions to protect the military's dominance, such as actually straight up reserving parliamentary seats for the military. Like, it does not matter if no one votes for them or their party or anything like that. And yes, it's going to sound confusing because the military itself is a political party. No matter what the situation is, no matter how many votes they actually get, there will be a minimum amount of seats that they will be required to have. As you can imagine, that doesn't exactly help a new fledgling democracy, and it creates a very strained relationship between those in power. It is this tenuous relationship and power sharing with the military that would eventually break down in 2021, and civil war would ensue. But you may wonder then, what exactly happened? Well, on the early morning of February 1st, 2021, the world would be shocked to witness Myanmar's military rapidly move in and depose its civilian government. The Tatmadaw would launch a pre-dawn operation to seize state power by arresting civilian government leaders, along with dozens of cabinet ministers. Members of the ruling party and parliament were also seized, and some activist and party supporters were also taken. Aung San Suu Kyi was detained, and other members of parliament were then forced into hiding in order to try and avoid the same fate. The military had seized control. Several hours after the raids, the military would appoint Vice President Mint Sui to assume the position of acting president while they went and figured things out. It was then proclaimed through the military-run Myawaddy TV that a year-long emergency was now in place and that power had been transferred to the commander-in-chief of the Tatmadaw, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. Now, this seizure of power would take place just before a new session of parliament was set to open. You may wonder at this point, why exactly did this happen? Why did they choose to specifically do this on February 1st? Well, the Tatmadaw would cite alleged voter fraud in the 2020 elections to justify their own grab for power. In the elections that were held in November of 2020, the ruling National League for Democracy, as I said before, the NLD, the one that won the previous election, won an overwhelming majority of legislative seats. If you're wondering what it is that I'm talking about, the numbers of the scenario, we are talking 396 out of a total of 476 seats. It was a overwhelming majority. In comparison, the party of the military, the Union for Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, they received only 33 states in union-level parliaments. That's it. So this was a pretty blatant grab for power. But what is so funny about this, weirdly enough, is that the military, it seems, did not actually plan on doing that at first. The military had said in its first statement about the election, not that it was stolen, but that the election had been carried out successfully. It would only later go and change its mind and say, oh, no, these results these don't make any sense. No, there was definitely voter fraud, and we actually should have gotten way more power than we did. Over the course of 3 months after the election, the Tatmadaw would increasingly amplify its allegations, constantly accusing the ruling party of voter fraud, among other things. Eventually, this would culminate in the coup d'etat. You would think if all that was the case, if all this was justified, that after the takeover, the Tatmadaw would immediately call for new elections and also for more oversight or regulation when it comes to this kind of voting. But no, instead, their immediate actions afterwards were to try and dismantle democracy itself within the country and break down the institutions. Following the playbook of dictators all around the world who go and seize power, the military began to arbitrarily arrest and detain political leaders, civil society actors, democracy activists, journalists, businessmen, innocent civilians, even foreigners. It did not matter who you were, the military was going to seize you if it even perceived you as a slight threat. Torture and murder in custody became widespread as a means to create a climate of fear among dissidents and encourage people to not go out and protest, to instead just stay home and let things pass. For those that didn't follow this rule, the new military rulers had no qualms with using violence and brute force terror campaigns against peaceful protesters in broad daylight, of which I'm probably not going to be able to show much of. There will only be images here, I'm sure. Thank you, YouTube guidelines. But if you're curious to see these things in action, there is a lot of footage of the military crackdowns in Myanmar in 2021, and I highly recommend that you check it out. Anyway, in order to suppress the anti-coup movement, the junta began to arm itself with repressive new laws that allowed it to effectively dismantle the people of Myanmar's legal protections. The new laws would pretty much remove any protections of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, association, privacy. None of that, if it even existed in the first place, was going to ever be possible. Of course, people were not happy. Protest would immediately begin in the capital. And this is something that would go on for months, with protesters demanding the restoration of civilian rule and democratic governance. In response, security forces would repeatedly use lethal force against said protesters, including late March of 2021, when over 100 people were killed in a single day. The military junta would also institute curfews and other limitations on gatherings in an effort to try and stop demonstrations from happening in the first place. As time went on, more slaughter would follow, as violence would escalate and the military tightened its grip, leading to events such as the Bago massacre in April of 2021. Now, my friends, the thing that I'm going to explain here is a truly horrible event, but there are many, many, many more like it. The reason that I am focusing on this particular one and not others is because if I spent the time talking about a list of all the varying different massacres and things that the military did, it would simply take way too long. We would be here forever. So we will have to focus on Bago as an example of what happened before and after the coup. To rewind a bit, before April, going back into February and March, in response to the coup, civilians throughout the country, including in Bago, which is a city in southeastern Myanmar, would go and stage large-scale protests to resist the military takeover. These protests, with time, would largely turn into armed resistance, with many different choke points being created in order to try and limit the influence and reach of the military. People would go out and build makeshift barricades, block off roads, really try to limit any ability for military convoys to come in and try and take over. As an example, the thoroughfare of Myawaddy Road, which was dotted with varying different homemade barricades erected by protesters, this is something that would become a key stronghold in Bago itself for any form of resistance. And the military, of course, was not going to take this lightly. In order to prepare for the coming conflict, in the weeks leading up to the massacre, the military junta had implemented a nightly internet shutdown in Bago. This is something that would become the norm, and people became used to it. Until, in the early morning of the 9th of April 2021, internet, phone, and electricity services were all disconnected in Bago. The idea of this being is that any coordination or planning or communication among protesters were going to be hampered. They could cut off access and eyes from the outside world of being able to see what was about to happen. At 4 a.m., the military would launch an operation with 250 soldiers raiding a number of Bago's residential wards. Military forces would block all of the city's main roads and restrict access to contain the population. Within the hour, by 5 a.m., security forces began to indiscriminately shoot protesters using battlefield-grade weapons, including assault rifles, heavy weaponry like RPGs and hand grenades, and machine guns. For anyone who actually managed to survive the attack, medical treatment was denied to them, and volunteer medics were even targeted by the military in order to ensure that people were not going to be able to recover. As security forces moved in, they gradually removed roadblocks that had been thrown together and would shoot indiscriminately among the population. As the massacre began, civilians would begin to fight back, launching fireworks and homemade projectiles at advancing military, throwing bricks, literally anything that could be a weapon, as they did not have the actual means by which to fight. But, as one could probably expect, this didn't really work. By 10 a.m., security forces had overtaken the last barricade, establishing effective control of the entire city. In the immediate aftermath of the events, it would be reported that at least 20 people would die. By the following day, that death toll had increased to 82. Naturally speaking, this would terrify people, and following the massacre, 100,000 residents in and around the surrounding 5 wards would flee. Victims' corpses were temporarily stored at the compound of Shan Pagoda, which was then cordoned off. People were not allowed to go near this thing. If you're wondering why that is the case, perhaps the military didn't want people to be seen as martyrs so that would potentially gather more protesters. No, the scenario is even weirder and more sinister. In the aftermath of the massacre, per the Bago University Students' Union, the military began to demand payments from families to go and retrieve the victims' corpses. So yes, they gathered all the corpses into one place and stored them there in order to hold them effectively for ransom. This itself is very confusing because per the military, there actually should not have been hardly any corpses to ransom in the first place. A junta-run newspaper would claim that only one person had actually been killed in the raid, despite all the bodies that were basically being sold. And that, my friends, is wild. But this was not the beginning of bloodshed, nor was it going to be the end. Much more was going to follow, as violent civil disturbances would fully escalate into outright civil war. But in order to have a civil war, you will need to have different factions. And if you can say one thing about Myanmar, oh boy, does it have a lot of those. Hello my friends, Takuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Rocket Money, which if you don't know what that is, I am not sure why considering how many ads I have done for them here in the past. Rocket Money is a service that I have used for many years. It is something that I would absolutely stand by. Do you ever have any subscriptions or anything that you forget about, that you like pay multiple times for, and then you just realize later on, oh crap, I forgot to cancel that? That is something that I end up falling into the trap of quite a lot, and many Americans do. Most Americans think they only spend like $62 a month on subscriptions, but because of everything that they sign up for, this number is actually closer to about $300, which is a lot. That is literally thousands of dollars a year, half of which most have probably forgotten about it. So Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps to find and cancel unwanted subscriptions. It also monitors your spending and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when they use all the app's features. So I'm telling you this now because, again, it is such a useful service. Stop wasting money on things that you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions. Go to rocketmoney.com/ho. That is rocketmoney.com/HOE. rocketmoney.com/HOE. Now, when I go and dive into this, I'm not going to explain each and every one of these, as to do so, just like when talking about the massacres and actions of the military, that would take way too long. That is not an exaggeration, mind you. There are quite literally hundreds of different armed groups involved in this in some way, shape, or form. And if I tried to explain that, there's no way that I could keep track of all of them, or for those of you who are watching, that you'd be able to either. No, instead what we need to do here is establish a general timeline, and then show some of the key players. In the months following the coup and varying different massacres, violence would only escalate. On the 15th of April, as the public refused to take part in the Thingyang celebrations, which marked the traditional Burmese New Year, plainclothes regime officials in Myawaddy, which is Saigang's largest city, would go and arrest Wai Moi Nang, who was one of the country's most prominent protest leaders, after ramming him with a car during an anti-coup motorcycle rally. The following day after this would happen, a committee called the CRPH, which was formed by elected MPs who managed to escape the coup, would announce the creation of a shadow national unity government, a NUG, which is how I'm more likely going to be referring to this here from now on. This was going to be an attempt by civilian dissidents to specifically create an alternative government to the top Manda, and from that be able to organize themselves. Among one of the first acts that they would put forth was the announcement of plans to pay the salaries of striking civil servants in order to actually allow them to be able to go out into the streets and do things. Despite the violence, a conflict was not necessarily guaranteed yet. Only a week later, junta leader Min Aung Hlaing was in Jakarta in order to discuss the ongoing crisis in his country with the leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. A 5-point consensus was reached that stressed the need to end the violence and begin a dialogue among all parties, and this is something that should have happened. However, it didn't. Crackdowns would continue, as did fighting in varying different states such as Kachin and Karen. Meanwhile, the month was going to end with 4 days of fierce clashes between the military and the newly formed Chinland Defense Force, or CDF, in the southern Chin state town of Mindat. Ethnic violence would only continue after that. Nationwide anti-coup guerrilla movements would begin to use improvised explosives to target alleged junta informants as well as suspected collaborators with the regime. And that is not a simple or easy action. We are talking about terrorist actions here. Guilty or innocent, no one was actually safe anymore. Armed resistance would escalate, with ambushes taking place all across the country. These ambushes and clashes would largely take place in varying different ethnic states, as government control would break down very quickly and ethnic militias would take charge. As one could possibly imagine, what happens when you have an ethnic militia take over, things can get very messy very quickly. We've seen a lot of that here in the Middle East in recent years. Moving into the beginning of May, on the 2nd of the month, thousands of anti-coup protesters would return to the streets across the country, and these were met with violence that would kill at least 6 people. The next day, amid lethal airstrikes by the military in the Kachin state, the Kachin Independence Army would reportedly shoot down a Myanmar Army helicopter in Momok Township. This being like one of the first cases in which an actual aircraft was taken down by rebels. Though at the time that I say this here, rebels is perhaps a strong word. Resistance fighters. Rebellion outright would come later, but not too much later. It is here then that the struggle against the military enters a new chapter, because it is on May 5th that the National Unity Government would go and announce that it had formed a resistance army called the People's Defense Force, PDF. The junta would respond 3 days later by declaring the NUG, the CRPH, and the PDF terrorist organizations. And now this is the date that many people consider as the true beginning of the official civil war, though outright conflict and direct fighting would not necessarily come until later. Which, on that note, it is here that I'm going to provide you with a list of just some of the names of the varying different groups that are involved in this. Over the course of this video, there are a lot of acronyms, and people, when researching this topic, will often have literally no idea what is going on, or who is who, or what is what, or what any of the acronyms mean. I'm actually going to leave a link down here in the description below with a list that I found, but just to name a few of what it is that I'm talking about. First up, we have the Myanmar Army, or the Tatmadaw, which is a name that I've used repeatedly in here as the whole thing is kind of interchangeable. Along with its affiliated political entity, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, and the ruling junta, known as the State Administration Council, or SAC. So if you ever hear any of those two things, that is what we were talking about. This is the military authority that launched the coup, setting off the civil war in the first place. Next up, we have the National Unity Government, or NUG, which was established in 2021 by Min Kon Naing, a prominent pro-democracy figure with a significant representation of members from ethnic minority communities. Min Kon Naing would declare that ousted leaders Aung San Suu Kyi, along with Win Myint, would retain their positions within the National Unity Government, and encourage and urge the international community to recognize their government instead of the ruling junta. The European Union would go on to acknowledge the NUG as the actual government in exile, and the NUG would go and appoint representatives in the USA as well as the UK. The People's Defense Force, the PDF, is what serves as its armed wing, and the NUG has instituted People's Administrative Teams, called PAAFA, to oversee areas under their control. These, my friends, are the two main political entities within the country, but then besides them, we then get into the varying different ethnic organizations that are also trying to either support one side or the other, or take over a territory and get independence, and it gets really confusing. First up here, we have the Northern Alliance, which comprises of the Arakan Army, the AA, the Kachin Independence Army, the KIA, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, the MNDAA, and the Taang National Liberation Army, the TNLA. The Northern Alliance is composed of these 4 different ethnic militias and is active in the Shan state. The alliance is also a member of the Federal Political Negotiation and Consultative Committee, or FPNCC. Besides them, you have varying other alliances and different ethnic groups in other states, such as the Karen National Liberation Army, or KNLA. Yes, when I say Karen, there is a literal army of Karens. I know the comments and the jokes that we'd probably get from that. This is something that operates across Kaya State, Kayin State, and also the Tananthari region. It is something that serves as the armed wing of the Karen National Union, or KNU, and is a member of the United Nationalities Federal Council, or UNFC. Previously, this is something that had a ceasefire with the government, but it would break that ceasefire following the 2021 coup. After them, you have the Chin National Front, which is a nationalist political organization that advocates for a federal union based off self-determination. It is a member of the National Unity Consultative Council. Along with them, you have the United Wa State Army, which operates in Shan State, and it is regarded as Myanmar's most powerful and well-armed army among everything. When we're talking about numbers here, they're estimated to have around 30,000 troops that are equipped with modern weapons. It is something that serves as the armed wing of the United Wa State Party, or UWSP, and is a member of the Federal Political Negotiation and Consultative Committee. The UWSA governs the Wa Self-Administrative Division, or the Wa State, and is something that maintains a de facto ceasefire with the government. In fact, this is an entity that is frequently, over the course of its history, allied with the Tatmadaw in order to combat Shan nationalist militia groups within its territory, including the Shan State Army. Unlike other armed groups, the UWSA is not actually pursuing independence or secession. It's not trying to break away. Instead, it engages in extensive businesses and trade with China to try and earn revenue from drug and weapon production. It just wants autonomy and free reign to basically do what it wants, but still be part of the country. Of course, that's not to say that it's not going to fight against the government and the military, because absolutely it would. Notably, the UWSA has acquired over the years surface-to-air missiles from China, from the illicit trade and what it has earned, in order to counter the Tatmandaw's air superiority, a critical asset for any kind of insurgent group. After that, you have two similar-sounding names, but I promise you they are very different groups, the PAO National Army, or PNA, and the PAO National Liberation Army, or PNLA, which you can probably guess based off the names that these are very different entities. Both of these operate in the Shan State, but the National Army is something that is allied with the Tatmadaw. It serves as the armed wing of the PAO National Organization and is responsible for safeguarding the PNO-administered PAO Self-Administered Zone, comprising of Hoping, Siseng, and Pinlong townships in southern Shan State. Since the 2021 coup, the PNA has actively recruited for the Tatmadaw and supported them. On the other hand, the Liberation Army is aligned with the resistance against the Tatmadaw and has pledged to support the National Unity Government in defeating the junta and establishing a federal system. Prior to 2024, this is something that actually had a ceasefire with the government, but it formally revoked that ceasefire in 2024 and began to coordinate with the local People's Defense Force forces, the PDFs, along with the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, or KNDF, to launch attacks against the junta and its aligned forces. Finally, of note, we have the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, which, yes, that is the same name as you see in a number of different communist states in history, and that is because it is. It literally is. This is affiliated with the Communist Party of Burma, or the CPB. The PLA was reactivated on March 15th, 2021, when communist fighters would cross from China into Kachin State. The Kachin Independence Army, KIA, rather than revoking them, actually provided them with weapons to combat the ruling junta. Additionally, the PLA operates within the Retaliatory region, situated in the southernmost part of Myanmar. And with that, my friends, that's all that I'm going to say here right now. Look, again, when I talk about this, there are literally dozens of major players here, with many more minor groups based primarily around ethnicity and ideology. It is a mess that would easily take an entire video series to try and digest, and I'm sure that I would lose most people watching this, including myself even trying to explain it in the first place. So, the question becomes then, what happens with the fighting then? Well, fighting was going to escalate in Chin State throughout the month of May. CDF forces in the state capital of Hakka would say that they killed 8 regime soldiers in 2 days of fighting that began on May 2nd. 2 days later, they would torch a police outpost as a warning to the junta. As armed resistance intensified in Mindat, the regime would declare martial law on May 12th and would send reinforcements to take control of the town. Thousands of residents would flee, but many of these were trapped as the army would cut off any source of food and water into the territory. In ethnic Karenni states, resistance fighters would launch a significant attack during the 3rd week of May. In Karenni State's Demoso Township, they seized 3 security outposts and days later would kill 40 regime forces in Mobye. This would mark the first large-scale attack of its kind by guerrilla fighters in the conflict. The military would respond by shelling residential areas, destroying religious buildings, and displacing thousands of civilians. By the end of the month, it had escalated to carrying out full-on airstrikes in Demoso. As varying forms of resistance to military rule would continue, guerrilla tactics became increasingly prominent, with police, soldiers, and regime collaborators being targeted on an almost daily basis. In an attempt to try and stop or at least deter such attacks, the junta would sentence 16 people to death for the murder in March of an alleged informant and his 2 sons in Yangon's northern Okalapa Township. In Mandalay, meanwhile, several buildings that were linked to the NLD, including many party offices, were hit by a series of attacks carried out by unknown assailants armed with guns and grenades. This would come not long after the regime announced that it had laid corruption charges against the party's leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. That is pretty bad, but it's not exclusive to just political leaders. Also facing legal pressure were doctors, such as Dr. Tartar Lin, the former head of Myanmar's COVID-19 vaccine rollout. This is an individual who was arrested for distributing around 161 million kyat, which was roughly $100,000 at the time, that had been allocated for the program to go to local health departments instead of handing it over to the regime. Yes, so this doctor that was using the money that was given to her by the government to roll out vaccines was arrested because she didn't hand that money over to the junta. She was among 25 doctors that were charged with high treason and colluding with an illegal organization. The illegal organization being, basically the health department. As clashes would continue in ethnic Karenni states, reports began to emerge of junta forces using human shields in Myawaddy, a town in southern Shan state located near the Karenni state, where some 100,000 people had been displaced by fighting, according to the UN. By mid-June, Karenni resistance forces would go and announce that they were suspending attacks on the junta in northern Karenni and southern Shan states amid a growing displacement crisis. They simply did not have the forces to be able to go and attack while simultaneously taking care of the people. The crisis would extend to northwestern Myanmar, where on June 15th, the military would set fire to Kinma, a village in the Magway region's Pok Township, destroying 80% of the houses. Fighting would also reach a major urban area on June 22nd, when the junta would attempt to raid a base belonging to a PDF group in Mandalay. A shootout would ensue, and the junta would claim 4 members of the terrorist group were killed and 8 arrested with their weapons. The officer leading the raid, Lieutenant Colonel Ong Myo Kya, was reportedly killed. Fighting would continue into July, and it is at this time that COVID-19 would begin to wreak absolute havoc across the country. Now, my friends, at the time that I'm talking about this, it is 2021. It is years into the COVID-19 pandemic. But you have to understand that this is occurring now within a civil war where basically all aspects of medicine and law have completely broken down. Infections of the virus would surge in July, especially in urban centers such as Yangon and Mandalay, as healthcare systems just collapsed under the junta. Hospitals would close or were at full capacity, and striking medical professionals were targeted for arrest. During this time, the junta would even ban the distribution of oxygen, except for authorities. They were still allowed to receive it. The people were not. Looking in the aftermath of this, per some civil society groups, anywhere between 600 to 1,000 people were dying every single day from COVID-19 in Yangon during this time period. In an attempt to try and limit the spread of coronavirus in prisons and also perhaps to earn some goodwill, the junta would go and release over 4,000 detainees from the country's detention centers on July 25th. But absent from this were anyone who had actually protested the military's takeover back on February 1st. Political prisoners were not going to be allowed out. As time went on, international pressure on the coup regime would grow, as the US would impose varying different sanctions against 4 companies, 7 members of the coup council, and 15 relatives of previously designated military officials in early July. Things would only get worse. Citing a collapsing economy and escalating violence throughout Myanmar, the Norwegian telecom operator Telenor would announce in July that it was pulling out. They were going to just leave Myanmar. What is interesting to note at this time is that even though all this violence, all this conflict, all this everything has been happening, technically speaking, it is at this moment now that things actually become official for the government. On July 26th, the junta's election commission would go and overturn the results of Myanmar's 2020 general election, the thing that led to the coup here in the first place. And of course, the ousted winning party, the NLD, would call the move an insult to voters, especially considering the military crackdowns that were taking place. Moving on into August, the coup regime would continue its efforts to try and fortify its rule. On the 1st of the month, Min Aung Hlaing would appoint himself prime minister of a caretaker government and would repeat a pledge to hold elections by 2023, which, of course, were not going to happen. Weeks later, he announced that he was considering changing Myanmar's electoral system from the existing majoritarian model to a form of proportional representation. In an effort by the regime to tighten its control over private banks, the central bank would issue an order on August 2nd, limiting both the number of foreigners in the country, in their banking sector, and also their influence. The economy, though, was going to be another major disaster for Myanmar, which we're probably going to need to go ahead and explain in the next video. Moving on, in a major mission carried out by underground guerrilla forces in the city, resistance fighters would shoot and kill 5 police officers on a train on August 14th, seizing their weapons. Days later, the junta would arrest most of these individuals that were involved in the attack. By the 3rd week of August, the military began carrying out clearance operations, these being efforts to completely, well, we're going to use the term clear, but in many cases it would be eradicate villages along the Chindwin River, near the border between Magwe and Saigon regions. Junta troops would storm the villages of Karpung Kya in Saigong's Taze township on August 26th, forcing locals to flee. As the military intensified its use of force against opponents of the regime, the NUG's defense minister, Yi Mon, would say that efforts were underway to try and unify the varying different PDF chapters across the country and urged more junta soldiers to defect. Considering conditions and what had been happening, thousands would do so along with officers. To encourage more to defect, some groups were even offering awards to soldiers who turned themselves in with their weapons. Then, in an effort to maintain control, the junta pulled a very unexpected move. They made a new law, making it a crime to commit offenses, quote, with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Yes, they outlawed genocide. It seems weird. That law simultaneously seems to have not actually been applied to Myanmar's military, which had been widely accused of committing genocide over the course of the previous years, especially with the Rohingya minority, but yeah, that did happen. Some 100 more people were killed by the junta in August, which would bring the total number of dead to over 1,000, and more than 7,700 were arrested. It is here, at this moment, on September 7th, that things really do become official. Myanmar's acting NUG president, Dua Lashi La, would announce the official start of a resistance war against the junta, and urged people across the country to revolt. 2 days later, the military began a campaign of terror in Magwe region's Gangwa township, which would kill 25 civilians and burn down 100 homes. As fighting escalated across the country, it emerged on October 18th that the junta had turned to retired soldiers in order to try and fill military ranks, as its ground troops were suffering heavy casualties all across the country. This is a problem that would persist for the next 3 years, but we're going to be getting into that later in the next video more than likely. For now, the conflict had reached a critical breaking point, and all hell was breaking loose. To finalize things here at this time, towards the end of 2021, direct armed clashes gave way to more bombings, more explosives, more landmines, more everything being used across the country. The PDF, with strong ground support from local communities, would attack soft government targets like police stations, outposts, and military-owned businesses. Through these, the resistance became more organized as they seized weapons, got training, and communicated between units with the help of the NUG and allied ethnic armed organization. As violence escalated, the already shaky economy would enter freefall. Now, I've made a number of videos about economic collapses of varying countries and how it is that they take place. Perhaps in going in and talking about the violence and the issues that this would make the subject of the next video significantly more relevant. But these things are going to be a story for the next time. As I explained in the beginning of this video, this will be my first multi-part video that I have done on this channel. The conflict is simply too big to cover in the span of one video unless I took multiple hours to explain it, and sadly, I do not have the resources for that yet, or even the time. I literally, at this moment that I'm recording this, I leave for a plane flight in like an hour. But with your support, I have been able to do what it is that I do, making content and telling stories, and for that I appreciate all of you. For those of you who want to support me more than just watching the videos, you can like, comment, subscribe, go back and check out my Patreon down in the description, or buy my coffee, which I also have linked down below. It's delicious, I promise you. I'm also planning on launching merch soon with a big partner, so that's a little bit of a spoiler, but hey, be excited because there's some good stuff that's coming. This was the first part telling the story of Myanmar's collapse. The nitty-gritty of fighting internal revolution and economic collapse that would come after, well, we're going to be talking about that next. Along with that, perhaps a shining light, as the conflict, just maybe, could be closer to coming to an end than we realize. But, again, that story is going to be for next time. My friends, thank you all for watching. This has been Sakuyi with the History of Everything podcast. I appreciate all of you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.